Jasmine Crockett faced Tucker Carlson live. 94 seconds in, and he lost control. In front of 12 million viewers, what began as a staged debate unraveled into a confrontation that no one could have scripted. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt. All she did was hold up a single printed email, his own words admitting the lie he'd sold for years. And suddenly, the studio wasn't a stage anymore. It was a courtroom. One built his empire on fear. The other walked in carrying nothing but truth sharpened by silence. And when Jasmine looked at him, not with rage, but with something far more dangerous, certainty, he blinked. And the audience never looked at him the same again. "I'm not here to win the moment," she said. "I'm here to outlive it." And in that moment, the noise stopped, and America listened. Because before she shook the system with a folder, before she left a legacy with a whisper, it started with an invitation no one expected, in a studio no one saw coming. It was never just another episode. The digital banner read, "The Reckoning Room, Truth versus Power." But it could have just as easily said, "Final Round." The network had spent weeks teasing it, a live, uncensored debate between two towering figures of American discourse. One, the flame that once ruled primetime cable news, Tucker Carlson, the face of polite outrage and calculated distortion. The other, a rising star forged in the fire of courtroom battles and congressional injustice, Jasmine Crockett, known not for her volume, but for her unwavering clarity. And now, for the first time, they would meet not in clips, not in dueling headlines, but on one stage, one night, live before a nation on edge. From the moment the studio doors opened, the air turned electric. Not with applause, but with tension. Thick, silent, crackling. The audience wasn't your usual late-night crowd. They weren't here to laugh. They were here to choose a side. The lights above the stage dimmed like curtains in a courtroom, and across the monitors the tagline pulsed in crimson and gold. One night, two truths, no exit. Viewers at home weren't flipping channels. They were holding their breath. This wasn't a show anymore. This was judgment. Behind the scenes, the producers walked on eggshells. One wrong word from either guest and a firestorm would erupt online. But that was exactly what they needed. Carlson arrived first, unbothered, polished, wearing a navy suit that screamed Americana and a smirk that said, "I've done this dance before." He nodded to the cameras like old friends. To him, this wasn't a debate. It was a resurrection, a chance to reclaim the airwaves he'd lost, not through apology, but dominance. He wasn't here to explain. He was here to win the room back. Then she entered, Jasmine Crockett. No entourage, no handler whispering notes, just the quiet weight of someone who'd sat through too many funerals for justice. Her suit was simple, dark, fitted, unapologetically sharp. The type of silhouette that didn't ask for attention. It commanded it. And when she walked past Tucker without a word, only locking eyes for a half second, every lens in the studio turned toward her like she'd just lit a fuse. The moderator, a seasoned anchor with 30 years of live television behind him, cleared his throat as the countdown began. He looked less like a journalist and more like a referee about to officiate a heavyweight match. 3 cameras, 12 million live viewers, and God knows how many watching with their phones in one hand and popcorn in the other. He mumbled under his breath. "Let's hope they remember the truth, not just the blood." The clock struck 8 p.m. sharp. The opening theme boomed like a war drum. "Good evening, America," the host began. "Tonight, you're not watching a talk show. You're watching a confrontation of worldviews. One night, 2 minds. And the question that divides us all. Does truth still matter?" The screen split in 2. On the left, Jasmine, hands folded, eyes steady. On the right, Tucker, leaning back, already halfway into a grin. It looked like balance, but everyone knew. This wasn't going to be equal. This wasn't even going to be fair. Carlson struck first, not with facts, but with presence. His opening statement was polished to the point of plastic. "We've entered an era where emotion replaces data, and people like Congresswoman Crockett capitalize on chaos," he said, every syllable oozing disdain masked as charm. He painted himself as the last sane voice in a sea of liberal hysteria. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. He wasn't playing to them. He was playing to the millions watching from basements and boardrooms, waiting for someone, anyone, to say what they believed but feared to speak. Then came Jasmine's turn. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't match his tone. She didn't need to. Emotion replaces data? She repeated slowly. You mean like when you pushed voter fraud theories you knew were false, just to keep your viewers angry enough to stay tuned? Her words were soft, deliberate, the kind of calm that follows gunfire, not precedes it. You don't represent truth. You represent the performance of certainty, the theater of confidence. The room shifted. You could feel it, the collective inhale. The first real punch had landed. Behind the scenes, network executives leaned forward in their seats. One whispered, "We've got lightning in a bottle." The chat feed exploded. Hashtags were born in real time. The show wasn't just trending, it was dividing households, offices, families. What had started as a ratings ploy had morphed into a mirror, and the reflection wasn't kind. Jasmine wasn't just debating, she was exposing, not just Tucker, but the system that had built him. Every word she spoke carried the echo of mothers who'd lost sons to policy, of immigrants silenced by fear, of children taught to mistrust their own history. Her voice wasn't loud. It was clean. It cut through noise like light through fog. Tucker, meanwhile, began shifting. The overconfidence in his posture dulled. He started interrupting more, joking less. He threw statistics like knives, selectively cited, twisted for impact. But Jasmine had come prepared. She didn't swat them away. She dissected them. That data you just referenced, she said, without even glancing at notes, came from a think tank funded by the very donors you once claimed were ruining America from the inside out. Your words, October 2020, page 3 of the transcript. It wasn't just a battle of ideologies. It was a war between ethical grounding and performative outrage, between someone who'd built her life standing in courtrooms for those without voices, and someone who'd been paid millions to be the loudest voice in the room, even when he didn't believe a word of what he said. As the first segment ended, the host leaned in with the gravity of a judge about to deliver sentencing. When we come back, he said, Congresswoman Crockett opens a folder labeled The Receipts. Stay with us. America is watching. They weren't just watching. They were holding on. The cameras weren't rolling yet, but the real show had already begun. Beneath the veneer of polished concrete and velvet curtains, the green room felt more like a war bunker. Whispers like falling shrapnel, studio assistants scrambling between tech queues and coffee orders, and one monitor in the corner playing a muted reel of Jasmine's congressional highlights on loop. It was in this uneasy quiet that Tucker Carlson sat, legs crossed, fingers steepled like a bishop before Mass. His calm wasn't peace, it was calculation. Fear, he muttered to a nearby producer, not bothering to whisper, is the most reliable brand loyalty in America, and I've monetized it better than anyone. He smirked. I don't sell news, I sell nerve endings. Laughter followed, tight, rehearsed, the kind reserved for kings who might still decide your paycheck tomorrow. Just 3 doors down, behind a plain black dressing room labeled Guest 2, Jasmine Crockett stood in silence. No makeup artist, no last-minute script notes. Her team offered to adjust her mic. She declined. We've already got too many people shaping how black women sound, she said flatly, tightening her own earpiece. There was a mirror, but she didn't look into it. She looked through it. Her eyes weren't on her reflection. They were on the weight of the moment pressing against the walls. She could hear the laughter echoing from Tucker's side. She didn't flinch. Jasmine wasn't there to win the room. She was there to remind it why it existed in the first place. A senior producer entered, clipboard clutched like a shield. Hey, just a quick suggestion. Don't go too hard, okay? He said, not unkindly. The audience connects better when there's balance. People like a little conflict, but not too much truth. Give them story, not indictment. Jasmine didn't even blink. You invited me to speak, she replied, not to rehearse your script. The producer smiled the way people do when they're trying to recover authority. Just saying, This isn't Congress. This is television. Jasmine zipped her folder shut. Then let's televise the truth. Meanwhile, back in Tucker's corner, his handlers were laying out talking points like weapons, phrases marked for emotional trigger, stats dressed in patriotism, and one particularly biting line about Jasmine's past policy votes. She'll be righteous, one staffer warned. She always is. Tucker only shrugged. She plays defense. I play performance. And tonight, I control the crowd. His words weren't loud, but they carried enough for a passing stagehand to freeze for half a breath. He wasn't preparing to discuss. He was preparing to dominate. The final prep bell rang, a 5-minute warning disguised as a polite chime. Technicians moved like soldiers securing the perimeter. Microphones were clipped, powder dabbed, lighting angles checked and rechecked. Jasmine sat at the edge of her chair, spine like steel. Across the corridor, Tucker reclined, legs stretched, as if the throne were already his. Then, without warning, Jasmine stood and walked into the hallway, folder in hand. Tucker caught sight of her through the mirror outside his dressing room. Their eyes locked, not long but enough to send a silent voltage between them. No nod, no smile. Just two titans staring through each other like ghosts in opposing mirrors. "What do you see in her?" Tucker asked a junior producer later, as Jasmine walked out of sight. "Conviction," the young man replied, too honest for his own safety. Tucker raised an eyebrow. "Conviction is just another word for predictability." He turned away. "Let's see how long it holds once the lights hit." Inside the control booth, the executive producer surveyed the studio with cold precision. She'd seen scandals, walk-offs, even fainting spells, but never stakes like these. "Ratings will spike," she said aloud, half to herself, half to justify what was coming. "Just make sure neither of them swears in the first 5 minutes. After that, let the blood flow." On screen, the timer ticked toward 0. The director's voice crackled into the crew's headsets. "Cue tension, cue framing shots, and stand by for impact." But the conflict wasn't waiting for the stage. It was already unraveling beneath it. A staff member whispered to Jasmine moments before she stepped out, "He plans to go personal." Real personal. She didn't ask how they knew. She just nodded. "Let him." Because Jasmine didn't need to throw the first punch. She was the punch. She'd spent years being underestimated, interrupted, reworded, and reduced. But tonight, she didn't come to be understood. She came to be undeniable. And somewhere deep in the network's data center, where keywords and trending metrics pulse like blood through silicon veins, early social spikes began to buzz. 2 names, 1 fight, millions of eyes, and a silence behind the curtain that felt less like waiting and more like aiming. Because what no one in the studio realized was this: the most dangerous voice in any room isn't the one shouting, it's the one they can't rewrite. And tonight, that voice wore no teleprompter, no contract, no filter, just truth. And Jasmine Crockett was carrying it like a blade. The moment the red light blinked to life above the center camera, the illusion of civility vanished. Millions of viewers across the country leaned forward as if drawn by invisible thread. The host opened with a question about national division, but it wasn't a question. It was a matchstick. And Tucker Carlson, poised like a veteran assassin beneath studio lights, wasted no time lighting the fuse. "What we're seeing today," he began, tone lacquered with sarcasm, "isn't discourse. It's tantrums in tailored suits. Your generation, Congresswoman Crockett, doesn't engage. It shouts, it cancels, it blames." The words fell like polished daggers. Not screamed, whispered but sharpened with intent. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. The venom was in the structure. Your generation, your kind, your outrage. It wasn't a question of opinion. It was a quiet indictment built on centuries of coded superiority. The camera cut to Jasmine. She didn't flinch, not even a blink. Because when you've been dismissed in courtrooms, doubted in hearings, and spoken over in chambers built by men who look just like him, you learn not to flinch. You memorize your enemy's rhythm. There was a long pause, not from fear, but from calculation. Jasmine reached slowly into the folder on her lap. No drama, no flourish, just method. She unfolded a single sheet of paper and looked directly at Tucker, then at the camera. "You want numbers?" she said, her voice calm, almost gentle. "Let's talk about HR 4212. You supported it in 2018. That bill allowed ICE to detain undocumented family members for indefinite periods without legal counsel. After it passed, over 3,400 families were separated. Children, some under the age of 6, held in cages your show refused to acknowledge even existed." She didn't blink. "Is that a tantrum, Mr. Carlson? Or just another Tuesday in your America?" The audience shifted, not audibly, but viscerally. Eyes narrowed, bodies leaned in. The tension wasn't theatrical, it was real, because Jasmine wasn't raising her voice. She was raising the bar. "You speak about outrage like it's irrational," she continued, "but I've seen mothers scream through glass barriers, begging to hold their babies. That's not cancel culture. That's consequence. And consequence is something men like you are allergic to." Tucker's smile faltered for the first time. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but for a man who'd made a career out of control, it was seismic. "You're misrepresenting the legislation," he said, voice clipped. "That bill was about national security." Jasmine didn't hesitate. "Then tell me, how does a 6-year-old threaten a nation? How does a breastfeeding infant compromise homeland defense? Or were they just the cost of keeping your viewers afraid long enough to boost your ratings?" The moderator, sensing the room slipping into something more volatile than television, tried to steer the ship. "Let's pivot to media responsibility." But Jasmine leaned forward, her tone now edged with fire. "No, let's stay right here. You see, this isn't just about a bill or a broadcast. It's about a pattern, a system, where people like me are told to stay calm, while people like him build careers out of coded cruelty." Gasps rippled from the live audience. Not shock at her words, but at their accuracy. Because while Tucker had painted her as a stereotype, Jasmine had turned the entire studio into a courtroom, and she was cross-examining the lie itself. Tucker shifted in his chair, and that signature smirk crawling back, weaker now. "I think it's cute how you wrap emotionalism in policy," he sneered. "It's performative righteousness. I've seen it before." Jasmine's reply was nuclear in its simplicity. "The difference, Mr. Carlson, is that I've lived what you perform. I've walked into ICE facilities you've never mentioned on air. I've held the hands of families your scripts erased. And I've buried clients who died waiting for the justice you mock nightly." The camera caught it, the first flicker of sweat at Tucker's brow. Jasmine didn't need theatrics. Her silence between sentences was louder than anything he'd ever screamed into a teleprompter. For a man who'd spent decades mastering the spin, he was beginning to realize, truth doesn't need to spin. It just needs to stand. The moderator cleared his throat. We need to go to break." But even he knew, this wasn't a break. This was retreat. As the lights dimmed and the show faded into commercial, the control room erupted into controlled panic. Viewership had spiked 18% in 3 minutes. Social media was on fire. Clips of Jasmine's calm dismantling were already trending. Hashtags surged. #, receipts not rage. Crockett versus Carlson. Truth just spoke. Back on set, Jasmine sat quietly, eyes lowered, folder closed. Tucker looked straight ahead, jaw locked, fingers tapping the armrest in uneven rhythm. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. This wasn't a debate, it was an autopsy. And the body on the table wasn't hers. The stage didn't move, but the world tilted. A thin folder sat untouched on Jasmine Crockett's lap, almost invisible beneath the studio lights, until she lifted it. Her hand was steady. Her voice didn't rise, but the silence that followed was deafening. "I've been accused tonight of emotionalism," she began, tapping the edge of the folder lightly, as if to wake it. "So let me offer something less emotional. Let me offer evidence." She opened the flap, pulling out a crisp sheet of paper marked with a familiar blue and white letterhead. The camera operators, sensing what was coming, instinctively pushed in. The moment was no longer a segment, it was history being read aloud. Jasmine held up the first page, glancing briefly toward the live audience. "This," she said, "is an internal communication from Fox News dated December 3, 2020, obtained through the Dominion lawsuit and made public by the courts. Her finger trailed down the page. A message from Tucker Carlson to one of his senior producers, and I quote, "We know this election stuff is BS, but our viewers want it, and let's be honest, they've earned the rage." Gas rippled through the room like aftershocks. Even the moderator blinked, mouth half open, as if trying to remember how to breathe. Tucker sat motionless, not blinking, not shifting, just frozen in the exact pose of a man who had spent his entire career building a persona and was now watching it split page by page. Jasmine continued, flipping to the second document with surgical precision. Here's another. January 5, 2021. Internal Slack thread from the Carlson show staff. "Let's not push back on the fraud stuff too hard. We don't want to lose the base. The truth's not the priority. Retention is." She paused. Then with venom she didn't even need to raise her voice to deliver, she added, "Not the truth, just retention." The camera zoomed closer. Tucker blinked once. A bead of sweat formed just above his right temple. His signature smirk, the tool that had deflected scrutiny for years, was gone. In its place, a tight jaw and eyes darting just slightly off camera, as if looking for an exit that didn't exist. But there was no way out. The receipts were too specific, too damning, and Jasmine hadn't even reached the last page. "You've spoken tonight," she said calmly, "about being a patriot, about protecting America. But what do you call it when a man knowingly feeds lies to his country just to keep a television audience?" She raised the final document. "This is from January 7th, the day after the Capitol attack. Maybe we pushed too hard," it reads, "but at least the ratings were fire." The crowd didn't gasp this time. They didn't need to. Their silence was heavier than any outcry. Jasmine placed the papers down, folding her hands. "You didn't make mistakes," she said, eyes locked on Tucker. "You made calculations. You sold fear like it was medicine. You offered outrage as comfort. And while families were grieving, while democracy was bleeding, you were cashing checks on lies you admitted weren't true." Every sentence was clean, weighted, precise. Not one wasted word. She wasn't speaking for applause. She was prosecuting a legacy. Tucker tried to respond, lips parting slightly. But what words could he possibly summon? His hands were still, unnaturally so. Even his voice, when it finally came, sounded smaller. "Context matters," he mumbled. "Those weren't admissions. They were reflections during a chaotic time." Jasmine leaned forward, eyes sharpened like blades. "You don't get to rewrite intent after damage is done," she said. "That's not context, that's cowardice." The moderator, pale and visibly shaken, attempted to regain control. Let's redirect to media responsibility moving forward." But the momentum had left him. The control room was ablaze with chatter, producers shouting metrics, social media feeds ticking upward like stock prices, editors already cutting the moment into clips for syndication. One network exec whispered into her headset, "We just aired his obituary," and she wrote it in real time. In living rooms across America, people weren't blinking. They were rewinding, watching again, replaying Jasmine's calm takedown like a courtroom drama with no edits, no commercial breaks, and no chance to look away. Viewers texted friends. Family chats erupted. YouTube uploads appeared within minutes. Jasmine Crockett dismantles Tucker Carlson with his own words. It was the kind of television that didn't fade by morning. It burned and it branded. As the segment drew to a close, Jasmine gathered her papers with slow precision, as if restoring them to their sheath like a sword returned to its scabbard. She looked up one last time, meeting the camera not as a politician, but as a witness. "I don't deal in conspiracy," she said, voice low. "I deal in proof, and if that's uncomfortable, maybe it should be." The screen faded to black, but no one in the room would forget what they just saw. It came without warning, midway through a commercial break, while the room was still smoldering from Jasmine's evidence drop. Tucker Carlson leaned back in his chair, hands folded with eerie calm. But behind the glass of the control booth, his team was moving fast, splicing together a preloaded segment they'd hoped they wouldn't have to use, unless she pushed him to the edge. Now edge met edge, and Tucker was done absorbing blows. He was ready to strike. The segment faded back in, and before the host could say a word, Carlson looked dead into the lens and fired the first shot. Since we're in the business of truth tonight, allow me a turn. The screen behind him lit up, a time-stamped video, congressional floor footage from 2 years prior. Jasmine Crockett, seated in silence, pressing the abstain button on a controversial housing policy bill. The bill, while riddled with federal strings, had been pitched as a lifeline for low-income families of color. And there, frozen in grainy resolution, was Jasmine choosing neither yes nor no. This, Tucker said, with venom dipped in faux disbelief, is the same Jasmine Crockett who claims to fight for justice, who cries for children in cages. And yet, when a bill arrived that would have directly helped those very families, she chose silence. The audience stirred. The live feed flickered with tension as the clip looped again. Tucker's voice was cold, steady, surgical. You see, the truth is, she's not a fighter. She's an opportunist, a tool, a face they push forward when it's politically convenient, and pull back when the choices get hard. He leaned in, voice lowered just enough to feel like a knife against glass. You don't need a folder of my emails to see that, just her voting record. For the first time, the energy shifted, not with applause, but with confusion. Eyebrows raised, phones lit up as viewers Googled the vote. A small murmur of doubt crept into the air like a crack in foundation. Jasmine sat still, but the blow had landed. Not because it was damning, but because it was designed to be just plausible enough. The perfect distortion. She had walked into a war of truths, and now the war was personal. The moderator tried to interject, but Tucker kept going. You talk about pain, he said, voice rising just slightly. But where were you when real reform demanded sacrifice? Where were you when your silence let bad policy win? The difference between you and me, Congresswoman, is that I never claim to be pure. You, on the other hand, wear a crown of moral clarity, and it's made of paper. He paused. Tell me, who are you really? Jasmine didn't answer. Not right away. Her fingers rested on her folder, but she didn't reach for it. She looked into the crowd, not for validation, but to absorb the moment fully, to feel the subtle sting of betrayal from those who had cheered her 10 minutes earlier and now blinked, unsure. It wasn't the accusation that hurt. It was how quickly people wanted to believe it. Because when you're a black woman in power, your silence is never strategic. It's always suspicious. She leaned forward, voice still low but now threaded with steel. You want to talk about that vote? She said. Let's talk. That bill was a trap. It offered aid with one hand and snatched rights with the other. It required biometric data from tenants, allowed warrantless inspections, and guess which neighborhoods it targeted? Mine. My mother's. The same people you've never met, Mr. Carlson. You saw abstention. I saw a grenade. I refused to pull the pin. The room held its breath. Jasmine's voice didn't shake, but it burned. You don't get to weaponize one vote you don't understand to rewrite my entire life's work. You call me a tool? At least I know who I serve. And it's not corporate media. It's not lobbyists. It's not fear. I serve the truth, even when it's complicated, especially then. The studio shifted again, not back to full confidence, but into contemplation. The audience wasn't clapping. They were thinking, processing. Tucker had planted doubt. Jasmine had fought to reclaim ground, but the terrain had changed. This wasn't just fact versus fiction anymore. This was a war over who gets to tell the story of integrity. Tucker, sensing the hesitation, smiled. But it wasn't victorious. It was thin. He landed his punch, but Jasmine didn't break. She leaned into the bruise and turned it into a badge. The camera caught it, the flicker of realization in his eyes. She had just reframed his entire tactic into a lesson. The segment closed in silence. No ad jingle, no audience applause, just a heartbeat stretched across the screen. On Twitter, the top trend read, #, paper crown, or shield. On TikTok, teens began slicing the clip of Jasmine's response into montages, adding music like it was a battle speech from a movie. In living rooms across the country, viewers asked each other the same thing. Who do I believe? And that, Tucker knew, was his only real weapon. Not truth, not facts, just doubt. And for now, he had thrown it like a grenade into her foundation. It was supposed to be Tucker Carlson's moment of control. He had landed his blow, introduced doubt, and watched Jasmine Crockett absorb it without flinching. But control, like illusion, shatters easiest when the magician forgets someone else knows the trick. And tonight, someone had. Just as the segment prepared to move on, a quiet commotion stirred in the control booth. The executive producer's earpiece buzzed. "We've got a call," a voice whispered, hushed but urgent. "It's real. It's from someone inside." The host blinked, caught between protocol and instinct, before finally raising a hand toward the director. "Patch it through," he mouthed. The screen behind the guest flickered once, then lit up. No face, just audio. Grainy, faintly distorted, but unmistakable. "This is from a private party in Georgetown, December 2022, the voice said. "No press, no cameras. But I recorded this because I couldn't believe what I was hearing." The studio fell to dead silence. Then the voice of Tucker Carlson filled the room. Not the one America knew, but something colder, arrogant, drunk with the scent of self-worship. "I could convince half the country," he slurred in laughter, "that the sun rises in the west. It's not about facts, it's about rhythm. They follow rhythm." Gasps, audible this time. The clip continued. "They don't want truth. They want confidence. And I've spent 2 decades feeding it to them like communion." The audio ended there. No outro, no credits. Just the raw, echoing proof that behind every wide-eyed broadcast had been a man who knew he was lying, and laughed about it. Tucker's face, lit by the blue screen glow, went pale. Not with guilt, but with the realization that the walls were no longer just closing in. They had started speaking. For a long moment, Jasmine said nothing. She didn't move. She didn't turn toward Tucker. She didn't gloat. She simply sat in the gravity of that recording. Shoulders square, eyes forward, the calm at the center of a national storm. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, deliberate, almost haunting. "That's why I'm here," she said. "Not to win a soundbite, not to trade punches. I'm here because when men like you decide that power matters more than people, someone has to remind the world what truth sounds like when it doesn't need a script." Her words hit harder than the tape, because they weren't retaliation, they were reclamation. She wasn't standing over a wounded enemy, she was standing inside the wreckage of a collapsing illusion and pointing to the rot beneath its gold paint. "You didn't lose your throne," she continued, voice gaining weight, "because you lied once. You lost it because eventually someone pressed record." Tucker opened his mouth, but nothing came. Not even a defense. Because how do you spin your own voice laughing at the very people you claim to defend? There was no editing that, no graphics, no American flag behind the lie to make it easier to swallow. Just truth, stripped bare and burning. The moderator turned, stunned, hands flat on his notes, as if they might catch him from falling into the moment. "Mr. Carlson," he managed, "do you have any response?" Tucker looked up, eyes sharp, not with clarity, but with panic concealed beneath composure. "That was a private setting," he said slowly. "People speak freely. That doesn't reflect what I present on air." Jasmine cut in, not with volume, but with precision. "And that's exactly the problem," she said. "You're not here to present what's real. You're here to perform. But reality doesn't bend for ratings. People's lives don't fit into your commercial breaks." The crowd shifted again. Not with applause, not yet, but with conviction. The arc was turning. Not because Jasmine raised her voice, but because the truth finally had no echo. It was center stage. For years, Carlson had built an empire on the belief that America feared discomfort more than it loved clarity. But tonight, America watched a woman stare discomfort in the eye and refuse to blink. In the control room, a producer whispered, "This clip's going to hit every headline by midnight." On Twitter, the phrase from the recording, "I could convince them the sun rises in the west," was already trending. Meme makers swarmed it. But beneath the chaos, a deeper shift was taking root. Viewers weren't laughing. They were reckoning. And Jasmine? She just folded her hands. Let the world catch up. She didn't need to explain. The evidence had already done it for her. She wasn't fighting Tucker anymore. She was fighting the part of America that had let men like him speak for it for too long. The lights dimmed for the next segment, but nothing could dim what had just happened. The illusion had unraveled. The mask had slipped, and underneath it was nothing at all. It wasn't supposed to happen, not to him, not on live television. But the carefully constructed fortress of Tucker Carlson's persona had cracked, and the man behind the smirk was unraveling in real time. His fingers gripped the armrest like a lifeline, his face flushed with something unfamiliar. Not outrage, exposure. The silence in the room after Jasmine's dismantling of his audio recording had stretched too long, too deep. And when Tucker finally spoke, it wasn't with poise, it was with fury. "You think you're better than me?" he barked, eyes sharp, voice rising, breaking through years of camera-trained control. "You think you have some moral high ground? You're no different. You, this crowd, the press, all of you are hypocrites." The room jerked as if hit by an unseen force. No one breathed. The camera froze mid-zoom. The moderator's face went pale as he looked toward the producers, unsure if he should step in or let the moment crash into itself. But Tucker wasn't done. "You all sit there pretending you care about justice, truth, fairness," he snarled, jabbing a finger at the audience. "But the second someone tells you what you want to hear, you don't question it, you worship it. And then you act shocked when someone like me says out loud what the rest of you think in private." His rant didn't feel like debate anymore. It felt like detonation. The pretense was gone. Gone was the practiced eloquence, the rhetorical spin. What remained was the raw core of a man who built a kingdom on certainty and had just watched it burn in front of a live audience. The crowd was no longer with him. They were stunned. Still. And Jasmine? Jasmine hadn't moved. She waited. Let the outburst settle like smoke in a battlefield. Then she spoke. Not with fire, but with focus. "I don't need perfect morality to stand for something," she said, her voice like a scalpel through the air. "I don't need to pretend I've never made mistakes. I don't hide behind ratings or sound bites. I don't trade truth for applause. I stand in what's uncomfortable because the truth isn't always flattering. It's necessary." She turned to Tucker, not with disdain, but with clarity. "You didn't break down tonight because I exposed you. You broke down because you already knew. Deep down, you knew the truth could only live so long in the shadows before it came knocking. And when it did, you didn't open the door. You tried to scream over it. That's when it happened. The first clap, then another, and then a wave of applause, slow, steady, growing. Not for drama, not for spectacle, but for honesty that refused to perform. The audience rose like a tide, not with roars, but with conviction. Even the moderator, caught in the storm of it all, struggled to regain his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, almost whispering, "we need to pause for station identification." But no one heard him. The story had taken over. The moment was alive. Tucker's eyes scanned the crowd, desperate to find someone, anyone still on his side. But the smirks had vanished. The subtle nods from earlier had been replaced with folded arms and averted eyes. And for the first time, he looked smaller than the stage that once bent to his voice. "You don't know me," he snapped, his tone brittle now. "You don't know what I've done for this country." Jasmine didn't blink. "No," she said softly, "but tonight we found out what you've done to it." The studio lights, bright and exposing, cast no shadow for Tucker to hide in now. The illusion had disintegrated. The throne had become a spotlight, and under it stood a man not battling his opponent, but battling the absence of belief. The moderator raised a trembling hand. "Let's take a short break," he managed as the producer in his ear shouted updates about viral spikes and emergency PR damage control. But no commercial could fix what had just happened. No sponsor could clean the blood from the floor. Because in that moment, Carlson didn't just lose an argument, he lost the myth he had built himself upon. And Jasmine, she sat still, not triumphant, not gloating, but grounded. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't insulted. She had simply held up a mirror and let him shatter himself against it. There was no spinning this, no walking it back. The question lingered in the air like smoke from a battlefield. What are you without the lie? And for the first time, America was watching a man who had no answer. It was over. The cameras cut. The credits rolled. But the tremor had only just begun. In the control room, a production assistant stared at the live analytics feed as the numbers exploded in real time. Within 2 hours, the broadcast had surpassed 11.7 million views, with replays spreading across every corner of the internet. TikTok stitched together Jasmine's silent stare as Tucker unraveled. YouTube flooded with titles like Tucker Carlson breaks down live and Jasmine Crockett owns the stage without raising her voice. Hashtags trended faster than the producers could track. The Truth Room, Jasmine Unfiltered, and the most viral of all, Sunrises in the West, a haunting echo of Tucker's own words used as proof of his downfall. News anchors who once hesitated to criticize Carlson now dissected him like a fallen monarch. He didn't just lose the argument, one commentator declared. He lost the mask. Polls released just hours after the broadcast sent shockwaves through the media ecosystem. 38% of viewers, nearly 4 out of 10, said the debate made them rethink their beliefs about media, truth, and who they trusted. That wasn't just a shift. It was a landslide. Carlson's defenders rushed to spin the moment, calling it ambush journalism, media manipulation. But it was too late. The court of public opinion had already cast its verdict. And then came the silence. Tucker Carlson, once the untouchable voice of primetime conservatism, vanished. No live rebuttal, no video monologue, no podcast comeback. His social media went dark. His network affiliation was quietly removed from internal rosters. Sources close to him told the press he was considering a break from media. Others whispered he was restructuring his brand. But no statement could undo what millions had heard with their own ears. His arrogance, his disdain for his audience, his collapse. Broadcast live and archived forever. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett did not celebrate. She didn't post victory selfies. She didn't tweet about trending numbers. She stayed grounded. That night, while others bathed in the digital fallout, she sat in her congressional office, alone, reading a draft bill she had kept buried in her drawer for months. It was a policy designed to combat misinformation at its root. Holding networks accountable for repeated, deliberate falsehoods aired as fact. Until now, it had been too controversial to touch. Now, it was urgent, and Congress was listening. The next morning, a letter arrived at her office, signed by 6 bipartisan representatives, inviting her to testify before the House Committee on Information Integrity. The subject: legislative solutions to the disinformation crisis. The invitation wasn't just ceremonial, it was historic. Never before had a congressional hearing been triggered directly by the fallout from a televised debate. But Jasmine hadn't just debated. She had prosecuted a disease in the American bloodstream, and now the system was ready to treat it. Across the country, the ripple widened. Educators played clips from the debate in civics classrooms. Fact-checking platforms reported record traffic. One school in Atlanta turned Jasmine's opening monologue into a writing prompt. What does truth sound like when it's not convenient? Op-eds poured in, praising her calm, her clarity, her restraint in the face of provocation. The Washington Post called it the most culturally significant moment on live TV since Watergate. The New York Times simply ran the headline, "A new kind of power just spoke, and America listened." But it wasn't praise Jasmine sought, it was purpose. For years, she had fought for communities that never made the headlines, families torn by policy, neighborhoods painted as statistics, and now the national spotlight had found her, not because she chased it, but because she stood still while others spun themselves to dust. They had underestimated her. They thought she would fumble when attacked. They thought she would crack. Instead, she became the quake. In the days that followed, Carlson's name began to fade. What remained was a question whispered across airwaves and dinner tables alike. How did we let this go on for so long? And the answer, Jasmine would later say in her congressional hearing, was chilling in its simplicity. Because we confused charisma with credibility, and we forgot that performance isn't the same as principle. The debate was no longer a trending topic. It was a turning point, a moment where a lie met its final audience, and the truth, steady and unbending, refused to blink. Jasmine Crockett had not just survived the stage. She had redefined it, and when the curtains fell, only one voice still stood unshaken in the spotlight. It wasn't the most dramatic moment. It didn't come with thunderous applause or a mic drop. No flashing graphics, no slow-motion zoom, just a sentence. A calm, measured sentence spoken into a still room by a woman who had carried every blow and never once flinched. The clip was under 15 seconds. Jasmine Crockett sat on stage, hands folded, eyes steady, and said, "If you build a career on fear, don't be surprised when the world stops being afraid of you." That was it. No music, no cutaway, no snarky punchline. And somehow that silence shook the world harder than any shout ever could. Within 6 hours, the clip had reached 10 million views. By the next morning, it was the #1 most shared political video globally. Celebrities reposted it without comment because it needed none. Civil rights groups printed it on t-shirts. High school teachers played it in classrooms and asked students, "What does power sound like when it stops trying to scare us?" Across platforms, the same phrase echoed in every language. Truth doesn't yell, it endures. Jasmine didn't speak to destroy Tucker Carlson. She spoke to unmask something much deeper. A system that taught men to weaponize fear and call it leadership. One user wrote in the comments, "She didn't destroy him with data. She destroyed him with silence and the courage to let it sit." Another said, "Carlson brought an empire of fire. Crockett brought water, and she let it burn itself out." But for Jasmine, this wasn't victory. It was validation. For every moment she'd been told to tone it down, to smile more, to wait her turn. For every time she'd been overlooked in hearings while men talked circles around facts. For every moment she was made to feel that composure was weakness, that fury was proof of instability, that clarity was somehow threatening. Tonight proved them all wrong. What stunned the world wasn't just the truth she told, but the way she told it. She never raised her voice. She never interrupted. She never insulted. And in doing so, she shattered the lie that power must roar. She reminded everyone watching that real strength doesn't need volume. It needs values. Carlson had views, millions of them. But Jasmine had something stronger, a spine that didn't bend when the lights got hot, when the noise got loud, when the opponent got personal. Inside Capitol Hill, lawmakers buzzed with questions, not just about legislation, but legacy. One senator whispered to an aide, "She didn't just win, she changed the standard." There was talk of her joining a new task force on disinformation, talk of a presidential advisory role. For once, DC wasn't celebrating spin, it was chasing sincerity. Jasmine had made something clear. When integrity finally shows up, even the loudest lie has to sit down. Behind closed doors, Tucker's inner circle scrambled. PR teams issued vague press releases. An unnamed insider told reporters he was retreating to reflect. But no rebrand could compete with what the world had just seen. His empire wasn't defeated by exposure alone. It crumbled because the audience had seen what it was afraid to admit, that the emperor not only had no clothes, he had no compass. Meanwhile, Jasmine returned to work like it was any other week. She refused interviews, declined podcast invitations. When asked by a journalist why she wasn't capitalizing on the moment, she smiled and said, "The truth doesn't need a victory lap. It needs momentum." She went back to her district, back to the community centers, the courtrooms, the schools where her real work lived. Her story didn't end on that stage. It just began. In a world where so many chase virality, Jasmine Crockett did something different. She showed up with no gimmicks, no theatrics, no agenda beyond one mission: truth with spine. That's why her words pierced deeper than policy, why her restraint cut louder than rage. Because while Carlson chased views, she stood in values. And in that contrast, America finally saw the cost of charisma without conscience. The moment would live forever, not because it was viral, but because it was vital. A reckoning not just of two people, but of two ways to speak to the soul of a nation, one with fear and one with truth. And when the noise settled, the story wrote itself in every heart that watched. When fear finally loses its grip, courage doesn't have to scream. It simply stands. The lights dimmed slowly, not all at once, like the closing of a trial, not a show. The audience remained in their seats, long after the credits began to crawl in the silent transparency across the screen. No music, no host's closing monologue, just stillness, a kind of reverence that doesn't follow a victory, but a reckoning. Jasmine Crockett sat unmoving under the stage lights as the technicians powered down the cameras. Her folder, now famous, lay closed beside her. She didn't speak. She didn't wave. And yet somehow that final silence said more than any standing ovation ever could. Backstage, producers whispered into headsets, their voices urgent but hushed. "We've never seen anything like it," one muttered. No one left. They're just sitting there. In the control room, a senior editor rewound the footage of her final statement, playing it over and over like a sacred mantra. On screen, Jasmine's voice, steady, unwavering, cut through the noise of modern spectacle with a line destined to outlive the debate itself. Truth doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it just refuses to leave. The editor stared at the playback, goosebumps rising. There was nothing flashy in her delivery, no grand hand gesture, no dramatic pause, just conviction, plain and pure, spoken as if it had been waiting its whole life to be said. Elsewhere in the building, Tucker Carlson slipped quietly through a back corridor, away from press, away from cameras. No handlers, no words, just the sound of his own footsteps on cold concrete, echoing louder than his voice ever had. He'd spent decades defining truth as something flexible, something bendable to audience demand. But tonight, for the first time, he encountered something he couldn't spin. A truth that didn't break when he attacked it. And now, for the first time, he was the one being edited out of the moment. Jasmine, meanwhile, finally rose from her seat, not to take a bow, but to carry her folder beneath her arm like a quiet weapon that had already done its job. She didn't speak to the crowd. She simply nodded once, then walked off stage, her heels echoing like punctuation marks down a hallway of hollow headlines. Behind her, the crew stood frozen, not from fear but from awe. One grip whispered, "She didn't need to win. She just needed us to listen." The rest said nothing. They didn't need to. Outside, rain had begun to fall, soft, persistent, like a baptism no one had asked for, but everyone needed. Protesters who had gathered on both sides of the political line stood still, some holding up their phones, replaying the now viral clip under umbrellas. No one yelled, no one chanted. For once, the noise wasn't outside, it was internal. A question ringing inside everyone who had watched her speak. What am I clinging to? Truth or comfort dressed as truth? The network didn't cut to a pundit panel. They didn't send out follow-up commentary. For the first time in years, the airwaves were allowed to breathe. And when the final frame of the night appeared, it wasn't a graphic. It wasn't a logo. It was a question. Stark white on an empty black screen, like an echo across eternity. If your words disappeared tomorrow, would your truth survive? No answer followed. No branding. No sponsored tagline. Just blackness. And yet that question ignited something seismic. In coffee shops the next morning, people didn't debate policy. They debated character. In classrooms, students rewrote essays not about politics, but integrity. At bus stops, churches, gyms, homes, people replayed that final moment. Not for entertainment, but for clarity. Because what Jasmine Crockett had done wasn't just expose a man or dismantle a legacy. She redefined a concept too long distorted. Truth is not performance, it's persistence. She had faced smears, interruptions, distortions, and doubt. She had been gaslit, underestimated, called a prop, a puppet, a tool of emotion. But in the end, she needed none of their tactics. Because truth didn't need to shout that night. It didn't need fire or thunder. It just stood, unbending, unbought, unmoved. And for the first time in a very long time, America stood with it. And as the screen faded to black, leaving behind only that one haunting question. If your words disappeared tomorrow, would your truth survive? The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded, like the last breath before a verdict. The moment may have ended, but its weight had just begun to settle. Across the nation, in the quiet between outrage and reflection, a deeper truth began to surface, one that went far beyond two figures on a stage. This was never just about Tucker Carlson or Jasmine Crockett. This was about the cost of choosing silence over integrity and the courage it takes to speak truth, not when it's safe, but when it's dangerous. Because in a world wired for noise, it's the calm voice of conviction that cuts the deepest. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk onto that stage as a hero. She walked in as a target, a black woman in power, holding truth like a blade while being expected to smile through insult, to remain respectable in the face of condescension. She wasn't just debating Tucker. She was debating every system that made room for him while questioning the legitimacy of her presence. Every pause she allowed, every word she didn't say, carried the scars of rooms where women like her were told to wait, to temper their tone, to play by rules written by men who never lived the consequences of the lies they televised. The injustice she faced wasn't only what was said aloud, it was the machinery beneath it, polished and silent, designed to grind voices like hers into performance pieces. But she didn't bend. She didn't yell. She didn't play their game. And in doing so, she rewrote the script. There is something revolutionary about restraint, something unnerving to those who rely on chaos. Tucker Carlson had built an empire on urgency, fear, and volume. But Jasmine proved that truth does not need to compete with chaos. It only needs to endure it. She faced his ridicule, his manipulation, his theatrics, and met each one not with aggression, but with stillness that bordered on defiance. Because in that stillness lived memory of every law that left her community behind, every speech that erased their names, every headline that distorted their reality. She didn't just speak for herself. She became the voice of those who had been fact-checked out of existence. What makes this story unforgettable isn't the fall of a man, but the rise of a principle. We live in a time when truth is negotiated, bargained, packaged for algorithms, when volume masquerades as substance, when performance gets more attention than principle. But Jasmine reminded us that the most powerful voices are not the loudest. They're the ones that don't flinch when the world dares them to blink. And she didn't blink. She absorbed every attack not as a victim, but as a vessel of lived clarity. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was a trapdoor beneath every lie. There's a lesson here about legacy, about the kind of truth that survives even when stripped of applause, stripped of platform, stripped of trending hashtags. Tucker built his influence on what people wanted to hear. Jasmine built hers on what people needed to confront. And when the lights faded, only one message stood unshaken. Truth isn't flashy. It doesn't always go viral, doesn't care about your ratings or your reel. But when truth is spoken, calmly, clearly, relentlessly, it stays. It carves itself into memory like justice etched in stone. But the deeper moral lies not just in what Jasmine said, it's in what she refused to say. She could have screamed. She could have humiliated. She could have weaponized his collapse for personal gain. Instead, she let him implode under the weight of his own contradictions. That's not just restraint. That's moral clarity. That's knowing the difference between revenge and accountability. And in a world addicted to spectacle, Jasmine chose the longer road, the harder one. She chose to be undeniable without becoming unrecognizable. So what do we take from this? The truth-telling is not a performance. It's a practice. That conviction is not born in moments of applause, but in the quiet, relentless act of choosing values over validation. That it's not enough to dismantle a lie. We must also become something worthy to stand in its place. Jasmine Crockett didn't just survive the debate. She transformed the space, made it sacred for a moment, showed us that integrity isn't passive. It's brave, even when it's quiet, especially then. And for those who face rooms where they are outnumbered, misunderstood, or underestimated, let this be the reminder. You don't need to shout to shake the walls. You just have to stand, steady, truthful, uncompromised, because eventually the noise eats itself. But the truth remains. And so, if you ever find yourself at a table where the lie is louder than your silence, sit taller, Let it echo. And when the time comes, don't try to outscream the chaos. Just say what needs to be said. And then stand in it. Because when all the headlines fade, all the numbers settle, and all the applause dies down, what matters most is not what you said, but what you stood for. So if the truth stood tonight, and it did, then the next question isn't about them. It's about you. Because truth doesn't stand on its own forever. It needs us, ordinary people, everyday voices, those who've been silenced, gaslit, told they don't belong at the table, to stand with it when it's most vulnerable. Jasmine didn't face that stage as an icon. She faced it as a woman who knew what it meant to be interrupted, dismissed, discredited, and still showed up. She stood not because it was easy, but because she refused to let lies go unchecked while millions watched. And now that you've watched too, what will you do with what you've seen? This moment isn't just hers to carry. It belongs to every classroom still teaching history that hides the hurt, every news feed that prioritizes drama over dignity, every comment section where facts are mocked and fiction is rewarded. We don't fix that by going silent. We fix that by showing up in small, powerful ways, by calling out misinformation when it creeps into our conversations, by amplifying voices that speak truth without needing to shout, by refusing to share headlines that thrive on fear instead of facts. You don't need a stage to matter. You don't need a microphone to make impact. You need only the courage to say, enough, not here, not anymore. So if you believe that truth deserves more than just applause, if you believe it deserves protection, defense, amplification, then make this moment count. Share this story, start that conversation you've been avoiding. Support the leaders, local or national, who speak with clarity instead of cruelty. Leave a comment below that doesn't just say, wow, but says why this matters. And ask the question Jasmine left hanging in the air like a challenge. If your words disappeared tomorrow, would your truth survive? Your voice matters. Your choices matter. And tonight, you are not just a viewer. You are a witness, a thread in the fabric that decides whether silence becomes surrender, or whether, like Jasmine Crockett, you'll choose to stand where it counts most. So stand before someone else tells a story for you. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.